In this video, I'll tell you the story of an American who lost $10,000 on a trip to Brazil. John, a 55-year-old American, came to Brazil for what was supposed to be a peaceful business trip, but which turned into the worst financial nightmare of his life. I'll tell you exactly how it happened, all the details John shared with me, and most importantly, how you can avoid going through the same situation. Stay tuned for the end because the outcome of this story is something no one expected. Before we begin, I ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment letting me know if you've ever experienced a similar situation. And please, stay tuned because the ending of this story is absolutely surprising and will reveal something that could save your life on a future trip. John works as a business consultant for a large American corporation and travels frequently to various countries for work. He wasn't an inexperienced tourist. On the contrary, he had visited over 40 countries throughout his career and had always considered himself a cautious person, prepared for the unexpected. Therefore, when he received an offer to come to Brazil to close an important contract with a Brazilian company, he didn't hesitate. The contract value was significant for his career and represented a unique opportunity for expansion into Latin America. The trip was planned 3 months in advance. John researched Rio de Janeiro, studied the best routes and the safest neighborhoods, booked a 5-star hotel in Copacabana, and even downloaded transportation apps before leaving. He spoke with colleagues who had already been to Brazil, and they all agreed that with basic precautions in mind, the trip would be smooth and enjoyable. The flight departed Miami on Sunday night with a connection in São Paulo. John managed to sleep a few hours during the longer journey, but the anticipation of the important meeting he had on Monday morning prevented him from fully resting. When the plane landed at Tom Jobim International Airport in Rio de Janeiro, it was almost 6 o'clock on Monday morning. John was tired but excited to begin this new professional stage. The airport was busy even at that early hour. John followed the normal international arrivals flow, cleared immigration without a hitch, collected his luggage, and headed for the exit. He had planned to use Uber to get to the hotel, a strategy that had always worked well on his travels around the world. It was convenient, safe, and he could always track his journey through the app. After leaving the arrivals area, John looked for a spot with a good internet connection to call an Uber. He opened the app on his phone and entered the address of his hotel in Copacabana, but something strange happened. The screen kept loading endlessly, and he couldn't find any available drivers. He tried several times, closed the app, reopened it, and checked for internet connection, but nothing worked. John wasn't an impatient person, but the situation was starting to bother him. He was tired from the trip and wanted to shower and prepare properly for the important meeting he had in a few hours. He looked around and saw that there were many people in the arrivals area, some clearly tourists like himself, others apparently airport workers or people waiting for passengers. It was then that he noticed some men with official-looking badges approaching tourists and offering assistance with transportation. One of them, who appeared to be around 35, was dressed casually but presentably, wearing a blue polo shirt and holding a clipboard. The man approached John with a friendly smile and asked in basic English if he needed transportation into the city. John, still trying to get Uber to work, explained his difficulty with the app. The man, who introduced himself as Carlos, explained that the app sometimes had connection issues in that area of the airport and offered to help. He said he worked with a licensed transportation company and could get him to his hotel quickly and safely. At first, John was hesitant. His travel experience had always taught him to only use official transportation or reputable apps. But Carlos seemed genuinely helpful and showed official-looking identification. Furthermore, John noticed that other tourists were also being served by similar people, which gave him a false sense of security. Carlos explained that they had licensed cars waiting in the departure area and that the price would be equivalent to Uber, perhaps even cheaper considering there would be no surge pricing. John, tired and in a hurry, began to consider the offer. The fact that Carlos spoke English and seemed familiar with the common issues tourists faced with airport apps made John let his guard down. What John didn't know was that Carlos didn't work for any legitimate transportation company. He was part of a gang specializing in scamming tourists arriving at the airport. They studied international flight arrival times, identified vulnerable tourists, and created seemingly normal situations to lure them in. The gang's strategy was sophisticated. They wore official-looking uniforms, had well-crafted fake IDs, and even drove cars that at first glance appeared to be legitimate ride-hailing vehicles. Carlos and his associates knew exactly how to approach tourists, what arguments to use, and how to create an atmosphere of trust. John, after a few minutes of conversation, decided to accept the offer. Carlos reassured him that the car was a recent model black sedan, and that the driver was experienced and knew the city well. He even showed a photo of the supposedly pickup truck on his cell phone, increasing the credibility of the situation. As they walked toward the parking lot, Carlos made friendly conversation, asking about John's reason for traveling, how long he would be in Rio, and offering tips on tourist attractions. This approach made John feel even more comfortable with his decision. Arriving at the parking lot, Carlos pointed to a black sedan that looked exactly like the ones used by ride-hailing apps. There was another man next to the car who introduced himself as Roberto, the driver. Roberto also greeted John in English, took his bags, and politely placed them in the trunk. John got into the back seat of the car, buckled up, and settled in for what he expected to be a smooth ride to his hotel. Carlos sat in the passenger seat next to Roberto and said he would accompany them to ensure everything went smoothly and that John arrived safely. For the first few minutes of the trip, everything seemed completely normal. Roberto drove carefully, obeyed traffic signs, and even played some soft music on the radio. Carlos continued chatting amiably, pointing out some of the city's landmarks and offering tips on the best restaurants in the Copacabana area. John relaxed and even took a few photos out the window, documenting his arrival in Rio de Janeiro. He reflected on how fortunate he was to find such helpful people upon arrival, and how stories one hears about security issues in Brazil don't always turn out to be true. About 15 minutes after leaving the airport, John realized they weren't following the exact route he knew to Copacabana. He'd studied the route before the trip and knew they would be passing through certain main avenues. When he asked about the route, Roberto explained that he knew an alternative route that would be faster, especially at that time of day. The explanation seemed logical to John. After all, local drivers always know shortcuts that tourists don't. He decided to trust the driver's experience and continued enjoying the scenery of the city he was visiting for the first time. However, as the minutes passed, John began to notice that they were moving further and further away from areas he recognized as central or touristy. The buildings became simpler, the streets narrower, and there was less traffic. A sense of unease began to creep over him, but John tried to remain calm and not show his concern. It was when Roberto turned onto a steeper, narrower street that John knew something was wrong. They were clearly entering an area that didn't seem to be the route to any hotel in Copacabana. The scenery had changed dramatically. Simpler houses, some unfinished, and a general sense that this wasn't an area tourists would normally pass through. John asked again about the route, this time with a more concerned tone. Carlos and Roberto exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, and it was at that moment that John noticed that the friendly expression on Carlos's face had completely changed. The smile was gone, and his eyes held a coldness that hadn't been there before. Roberto stopped the car in a more secluded area, surrounded by simple houses and with few people around. John's heart raced as he realized he was in real danger. Carlos turned to him and, in a tone completely different from his previous one, said they needed to sort out a few things before continuing their journey. The change in behavior was so sudden that John was momentarily paralyzed. He tried to understand what was happening, whether it was some kind of misunderstanding or if he was actually the victim of a crime. The reality of the situation began to sink in when Carlos told John that he would have to cooperate if he wanted to get out of there without any major problems. John realized he had fallen into a carefully planned trap. Everything that had seemed legitimate at the airport, the badges, the identification, the official-looking car, the professional approach, had all been staged to lure him into this vulnerable situation. Now I need to pause the story to share something very important with you. If you're enjoying this content and think it could help others avoid situations like John's, I've created an exclusive resource. Go to the description of this video or the first pinned comment and download the ebook Brazil Unlocked, where I share all the most common scams used against tourists in Brazil and specific strategies to avoid falling for each one. It's comprehensive material that can literally save your money and even your life while traveling. Don't forget to download it. It's valuable information you won't find anywhere else. Returning to John's story, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Roberto kept the car running but stationary, while Carlos explained to John that they would have to sort out a few details before continuing the trip. His tone wasn't exactly threatening, but John could sense the complete shift in the energy in the room. John tried to remain calm and asked what was going on, still hoping it was some kind of misunderstanding. Carlos then explained that there would be an additional fee for the ride and that they would need to stop at a few locations before reaching the hotel. John immediately realized it wasn't a legitimate fee and that he was being extorted. John's first reaction was to try to negotiate. He offered to pay an additional amount in cash as long as they took him directly to the hotel. John had about $300 in cash, which he considered enough to solve any transportation problems. But Carlos laughed and said the situation was more complicated than that. It was then that Roberto joined the conversation and explained that they would need to go to some ATMs for John to make withdrawals. They also mentioned that they would need to use John's credit cards for some necessary purchases. At that moment, John fully understood that he had fallen for an elaborate scam and that he was in serious danger. John tried to argue that he didn't have the card pins or that the withdrawal limits were low, but Carlos proved to be well aware of how these scams worked. He explained that they had time and patience, and that John would have to cooperate if he wanted to get out of this situation without serious consequences. The sense of despair that gripped John at that moment is difficult to describe. He was completely alone, in a foreign country, in an unfamiliar area, in the hands of criminals who clearly had experience in this kind of situation. He thought about the important meeting he had in a few hours, the contract he might lose, but most of all, the possibility of not being able to get out of this situation. John realized he didn't have many options. He was alone against two men in an unfamiliar area, unsure of where he was or how to call for help. His cell phone had signal, but he didn't know who to call or how to explain his location. Furthermore, Carlos and Roberto made it clear that any attempt to call for help would only make the situation much worse for him. The first stop was an ATM in a relatively busy commercial area. Carlos accompanied John to the machine, staying close enough to observe everything he did, but trying to maintain a normal appearance for anyone watching from afar. John was instructed to withdraw the maximum daily limit, which was $1,000 on his card. John tried to withdraw a smaller amount, hoping they'd settle for less, but Carlos immediately noticed and demanded he try again with the maximum amount. When John told him his limit was lower, Carlos demonstrated his thorough understanding of American cards and insisted he try different amounts until he found the actual limit. The withdrawal was successful, and John saw $1,000 leaving his checking account. Carlos immediately took the money, counted it in front of John, and told him this was just the beginning. They returned to the car, where Roberto was waiting, and headed to another location. Their next stop was a shopping mall. This time, Roberto also got out of the car, and they entered the store together. John was taken to several stores where he was forced to make purchases with his credit cards. They bought electronics, clothes, perfume, and other valuable items, always choosing items that could be easily resold. With each purchase, John was instructed to act normally, as if he were actually shopping. Carlos and Roberto took turns, one staying nearby to keep watch while the other selected the items. They had a clear strategy and seemed well-versed in credit card limits and the best ways to maximize purchases. Throughout the entire ordeal at the mall, John was in a state of shock and despair that's hard to imagine. Each purchase represented hundreds of dollars draining his bank account, and he knew the longer he stayed in that situation, the greater the financial loss would be. Furthermore, with every passing minute, his chances of making it to the business meeting diminished. John tried at times to discreetly signal to salespeople or other customers, hoping someone would notice something was wrong. But Carlos and Roberto were very experienced in these kinds of situations. They knew exactly how to behave to make everything seem normal. They chatted casually, smiled when necessary, and treated John as if he were a friend shopping. At one electronics store, John was forced to buy 2 high-end smartphones, a tablet, and some expensive accessories. The total purchase cost nearly $3,000. When his card was processed and the purchase was approved, John felt a physical sensation of nausea at the thought of the impact this would have on his finances. Carlos, sensing John's emotional state, told him that if he continued cooperating, everything would be over soon and he could continue his trip as normal. He even suggested that it was just a travel incident and that John should view it as part of the experience of getting to know a new country. This attempt to normalize the criminal situation angered John even more, but he knew he had no choice but to continue cooperating. The next stop was a designer clothing and accessories store. Roberto selected several men's clothing items, expensive sunglasses, watches, and other accessories. Once again, John was instructed to pay for everything with his card. The clerk, seemingly unsuspecting, processed the purchase as usual, and another $2,500 was debited from John's account. All this time, John was mentally calculating the losses he had already accumulated. Between cash withdrawals and forced purchases, he had already lost over $6,000. And judging by Carlos's comments, they weren't over yet. John realized he could be losing much more money than he initially imagined. I need to interrupt the narrative again to ask a direct question to those of you watching. Have any of you ever experienced a security issue or attempted scam here in Brazil, whether as a tourist or even as a Brazilian? Leave your experiences in the comments, because sharing this information really helps others protect themselves. And if you found this content useful, don't forget to like the video. This really helps the channel grow and reach more people who need this information. Returning to John's story, after shopping at the mall, they returned to the car and headed to another ATM. Carlos explained that they needed to try withdrawing cash with other cards John had in his wallet. John tried to argue that the other cards had lower limits or that some didn't even allow international withdrawals. But Carlos insisted they try them all. At the second ATM, John was forced to attempt withdrawals with 3 different cards. 2 of them didn't work for international withdrawals, but the third, an emergency card John rarely used, allowed a withdrawal of $800. Carlos was visibly pleased and commented that they were making good progress. John began to calculate how long this situation could last. He realized that if they continued at this rate, they could easily max out their cards and bank accounts. The business meeting was already lost. It was almost 11 in the morning, and he was supposed to be at the clients by 9. But at that moment, the meeting was the least of his worries. Roberto suggested they go to another area of the city, where there were more shops and ATMs. Along the way, John tried to memorize the streets and landmarks, hoping to provide useful information to the police if he managed to get out of this situation. But the city was large and unfamiliar to him, making this task difficult. They stopped at what appeared to be a popular shopping center, with many small shops and a busy traffic flow. Carlos said it was a good place to finish business. John didn't quite understand what that meant, but from his tone, he could tell there would be more forced spending. The first store in this new area was a currency exchange and electronics store. Roberto chose several items: cameras, sound equipment, electronic games, and various accessories. The store owner, who seemed to know Roberto, didn't ask questions about the quantity or variety of items selected. John was again instructed to pay by credit card, and another $3,200 was debited. John began to suspect that this wasn't the first time Carlos and Roberto had pulled this kind of operation at that store. The ease with which everything unfolded and the familiarity between Roberto and the owner suggested they had a partnership established for this kind of situation. John realized he had stumbled into a much more organized and professional scheme than he had initially imagined. At the next store, a boutique selling imported perfumes and cosmetics, they repeated the same process. Carlos chose several expensive perfumes, creams, and beauty products that were clearly intended for resale later. John was forced to pay another $1,800, all under the discreet but constant surveillance of his captors. Throughout this process, John held out hope that someone would notice something was wrong and offer help. But the reality was that Carlos and Roberto were very skilled at maintaining the appearance of normalcy. To the casual observer, they appeared to be three friends shopping together. At one point, John tried a different strategy. He told his captors that his cards had a security system that would automatically lock them after a certain number of transactions in a short period of time. It was a lie, but John hoped it would limit the duration of his financial torture. Carlos, however, seemed very knowledgeable about how international credit cards work. He said he was familiar with these security systems and that they had strategies to circumvent them. He suggested taking breaks between purchases and varying the types of establishments to avoid the automatic blocking. Carlos's strategy worked. They took a break for about an hour, during which they stayed at a diner where Roberto and Carlos ate peacefully, while John, starving and in shock, simply watched the street scene. By this point, John calculated he had already lost over $15,000 between withdrawals and forced purchases. John tried again to reason with his captors, this time appealing to their humanity. He explained the importance of the business meeting he had missed, the financial impact this situation was having on his life, and urged them to be content with what they had already obtained. But Carlos was clear that they weren't finished yet, and that John should continue cooperating. After the break, they headed to another shopping area. John noticed they were following a planned route, visiting specific establishments where they had clearly operated before. The organization and methodology of the scheme impressed John negatively. He was dealing with professional criminals who did this regularly. The next stop was a sports equipment store. Roberto chose expensive sneakers, brand-name clothing, gym equipment, and various accessories. John was once again forced to pay, this time $2,400. With each approved transaction, John felt as if a part of his financial life was being destroyed. Carlos then informed John that they would make one more attempt to withdraw cash. They went to a different bank's ATM, where John was instructed to try again with all his cards. To his dismay, two of the cards allowed additional withdrawals, totaling another $1,200 in cash, which Carlos immediately took. John was beginning to calculate that his total loss was approaching $20,000. It was a sum that represented months of work and would have a significant impact on his personal finances. Furthermore, he began to worry about the professional consequences of the missed meeting and how he would explain his absence to the client and his company. At this point, I need to share with you again the importance of having accurate travel safety information. For those of you watching and concerned about your safety when traveling, be sure to access the description of this video or the first pinned comment to download the ebook Brazil Unlocked. In it, I explain in detail how this and other scams used against tourists in Brazil work, what warning signs John should have noticed, and most importantly, practical strategies to avoid falling into these traps. It's a resource that can literally save you thousands of dollars and prevent traumas like the one John is experiencing in this story. Continuing John's story, after the additional withdrawals, Carlos announced that they would make the last shopping spree. John felt a momentary relief, thinking that the nightmare was coming to an end, but soon realized that the last shopping spree didn't necessarily mean fewer purchases. They headed to a larger mall, lined with department stores and international brands. Roberto seemed to have a mental list of items he wanted to buy. They visited an electronics store where they purchased 2 laptops, car stereos, and various tech accessories. The total cost was $4,300. John was beginning to feel resigned. He realized that resisting or trying to argue wasn't working, and that the more he cooperated, the sooner this situation would end. It was cruel logic, but at that moment it seemed like his only option for surviving this nightmare. At the next store, a women's clothing boutique, Roberto selected a variety of expensive dresses, handbags, shoes, and accessories. John found it odd to see Roberto choosing women's clothing so familiarly, but didn't comment. Another $1,900 was forced onto his credit card. Charles then said they would make one last stop at a jewelry store. John felt his heart race, knowing jewelry could be very expensive. At the jewelry store, Roberto chose some mid-range pieces, not the most expensive in the store, but not the cheapest either. John was forced to pay $2,800 for items he couldn't even see properly. Such was his stress. As they left the jewelry store, John did a quick mental calculation and realized he had already lost over $20,000. That was exactly the amount he had as an emergency limit on his combined cards. Carlos and Roberto seemed to know exactly what the limits were and had calculated precisely to maximize the amount stolen. Carlos then announced that they were finished and that they would take John to his hotel. For John, those were the most welcome words he had heard all day. Even though he had lost a staggering amount of money, he was relieved to know that the situation was coming to an end and that he would come out of it alive. The return trip was made in almost complete silence. John was physically and emotionally exhausted, while Carlos and Roberto seemed satisfied with the work they had accomplished. John observed the landscape, trying to commit to memory details that might be useful for a potential report to the police, though he wasn't sure if that would be safe or advisable. When they finally arrived at the hotel in Copacabana, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. John had completely lost his business meeting and almost all of his emergency fund. Carlos and Roberto said goodbye almost cordially, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and left, leaving John at the hotel door with their luggage. Upon entering the hotel, John was greeted by the visibly concerned reception staff, who asked if he was okay. Apparently, the Brazilian client John was supposed to be meeting with had called several times trying to reach him. John briefly explained that he had had problems with the airport shuttle, but didn't elaborate on what had actually happened. In the hotel room, John finally had the opportunity to emotionally process everything he had experienced. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his phone, unsure of what to do first. Should he call the police? His company? The bank? His family? Each option brought complications and consequences he wasn't prepared to face at that moment. John's first call was to his company, explaining that he had a medical emergency and couldn't make the meeting that day. It was a lie, but John didn't feel ready to explain the truth at that moment. He rescheduled the meeting for the next day, hoping to recover emotionally by then. John then called his bank in the United States to report suspicious use of his cards. When he began reporting the transactions, the agent was overwhelmed by the sheer number and amounts involved. John had to explain each purchase and withdrawal in detail, a humiliating process that made him relive the trauma of the experience. The bank said it could cancel the cards immediately and would investigate the transactions, but explained that the dispute process could take weeks or even months, especially for purchases made abroad. Furthermore, many of the transactions had been authorized with a PIN, which would complicate the refund process. John then faced a difficult dilemma. Should he report the crime to the Brazilian police? He researched the procedures online and worried that he might have to stay in the country longer than planned to give statements and monitor the investigation. Furthermore, he didn't have accurate information about the location where the incident occurred or sufficient information about the perpetrators. After much consideration, John decided not to immediately report the incident to the local police. He feared it would further complicate his situation and could even put him in further danger if Carlos and Roberto found out about the report. John knew this decision might be questionable, but at that moment his priority was to minimize the damage and return home as quickly as possible. The next day's business meeting was a disaster. John tried to maintain professional composure, but he was visibly shaken and unfocused. The Brazilian client, sensing something was wrong, repeatedly asked if John was okay. The negotiation, which was supposed to result in a significant contract for John's career, was poorly conducted, and in the end, the client decided not to close the deal. John realized that the scam had damaged not only his personal finances, but also his professional career. The opportunity that had motivated the entire trip was lost, and he would have to explain to his superiors why such an important contract had not been closed. How could he explain that his performance had been affected by being a victim of a crime without sounding like an excuse? During the following days in Rio de Janeiro, John lived in a constant state of paranoia and fear. Every time he left the hotel, he felt watched and unsafe. People approaching him on the street caused anxiety, and he avoided using any form of transportation other than the hotel's official taxi. The experience had deeply traumatized his sense of security. John also discovered that the financial damage was even greater than he initially estimated. In addition to the $20,000 direct expense, he incurred additional costs from canceled cards, bank fees, international calls, and even extra hotel expenses from having to extend his stay to deal with the bureaucratic aftermath. The emotional impact was perhaps even more significant than the financial. John, who had always considered himself a cautious and experienced traveler, felt humiliated at having fallen for such an elaborate scam. He constantly questioned his decisions that day, wondering what he could have done differently to avoid the whole situation. When John finally returned to the United States, he had to face the professional consequences of his failed trip. His superiors questioned the failure of the negotiation, and John chose not to tell the full truth about what had happened. He feared it would affect his professional credibility and even his position within the company. The process of recovering the stolen funds took months. The bank managed to reverse some transactions, especially those made in rapid succession that generated automatic fraud alerts. However, most of the funds were not recovered because the purchases had been made in the cardholder's physical presence and with the use of a PIN. John estimated that, at the end of the entire process, he had only recovered about $4,000 of the $20,000 he had lost. The net loss of $16,000 had a significant financial impact on his life, forcing him to cancel vacation plans, postpone the purchase of a new car, and drastically reduce his monthly expenses for a considerable period. But perhaps the most lasting consequence was the psychological impact. John developed an aversion to international travel, especially to developing countries. When his company offered business opportunities abroad, he consistently declined, preferring to send colleagues in his place. This negatively impacted his career trajectory as he missed out on several opportunities for professional growth. John also began to experience anxiety in situations that resembled aspects of the attack. Using ride-hailing apps, even in the United States, caused discomfort. Making purchases with a credit card in unfamiliar stores made him nervous. Talking to strangers in airports or tourist areas triggered a state of alertness that hadn't existed before the traumatic experience. Months after the incident, John decided to seek professional help to deal with the trauma. A psychologist specializing in crime victims explained that his reactions were normal and expected after a victimization experience like the one he had experienced. The emotional recovery process took almost a year of regular therapy. During therapy sessions, John realized he had developed excessive guilt over what had happened. He constantly criticized himself for being so naive and for falling for such an obvious scam. The therapist helped John understand that he had been the victim of professional criminals using sophisticated manipulation techniques and that anyone could have fallen into the same trap. Over time, John was able to process the experience more rationally. He began sharing his story with friends and colleagues, not as a source of shame, but as an educational wake-up call. John realized that many people had similar experiences or knew someone who had, and that talking openly about the subject helped both him and others. John also became an advocate for travel safety education. He began researching common scams targeting tourists in various countries and sharing this information on online forums and travel groups. For John, transforming his traumatic experience into useful knowledge for others became a way to find positive meaning in something so negative. Today, 3 years after the incident, John is traveling internationally again, but with a much higher level of preparation and security awareness. He no longer accepts rides from people who approach him at airports, always verifies drivers' official IDs through apps, keeps his credit card limits low while traveling, and always informs someone he trusts about his travel plans. John has also developed specific strategies for risky situations. He always carries an extra cell phone with a local SIM card from the country he's visiting, keeps cash and cards separate, and always researches the most common scams in the destination he's visiting in advance. These precautions have become second nature to him. John's story teaches us several important lessons about travel security. First, airport scammers are extremely sophisticated and convincing. They study traveler behavior, understand common vulnerabilities, and create situations that appear completely legitimate. Second, technical issues with apps are often exploited by scammers as opportunities to offer alternative solutions. Third, it's essential to always verify the legitimacy of any transportation service through official channels. If an app isn't working, the solution is to look for official taxi or transportation counters within the airport itself. Never accept offers from people who approach passengers in the arrivals area. Fourth, professional criminals are extremely adept at maintaining a semblance of normality while carrying out their crimes. For anyone planning a trip to Brazil or any other country, I highly recommend subscribing to this channel for more travel safety content. Like this video if you found John's story helpful, and most importantly, comment below with your thoughts. Have any of you experienced anything similar? What precautions do you take when traveling? And don't forget, the best defense against scams is information. The more we know about the tactics used by criminals, the better prepared we are to identify risky situations and avoid falling into traps. John's story is an extreme example, but similar situations happen every day to tourists around the world. If you know someone planning to travel to Brazil or any international destination, share this video. Information saves lives and protects assets. And remember, being cautious isn't paranoid, it's smart. Also, watch our next recommended video, where I tell the story of a family who fell for the fake medical emergency scam in Cancun and lost $15,000 in just 2 hours. It's another shocking story every traveler should know. Thanks for watching until the end. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and we'll see you in the next report. Travel safely.